Fuck you.
That's how you do it?
On Emergence Day, the Locust rose up from the underground of Sarah to wage war against humanity. Over the next 2 decades, both species would be drawn near to the bed of extinction, trying to wipe one another off the map. And while the standout of the Locust are their immense hordes of drones, wretches, and all the other little nasties, an important part of their DNA has always been the heavy hitters, the elites and leaders of the horde. Welcome all you beautiful ladies and animals, as today we go over all the villains of Gears of War and analyze them for effectiveness as a villain within the story, trying to see how effective they really are from a narrative lens, or if they just get off on aura farming and get little else done. As always, a big thank you to my members and patrons who you can enlist beside for just $1 a month. Stick around to the end if you'd like to learn more, but with that, let's just get right into it. And if I sound a little plugged up, I've been dying for the whole last week, so thank you very much for asking. Now, the idea of a good villain in any story comes through a lot of different compounding factors, especially in the realm of video games. Because at the most basic level, you have personal villains and external villains. A good example of both in the same story is Thor and Odin in God of War Ragnarok. The game hinges on Kratos trying to avoid and become better than his past of reckless rage, then learning how he can apply his strengths and choose to be a good guy rather than be controlled by the monster within him. If you want to break down on Kratos, I made a whole video about that. Then you have Thor, a personal foil to Kratos. Even though the two don't spend a lot of time together on screen, Thor's story is very clearly close to Kratos' own. Thor is a destroyer, manipulated by the gods above him to be a weapon, a tool. Nothing about his family is taken into care by Odin. As far as the Allfather is concerned, Thor is a means to an end, a sledgehammer. In that way, his story is personal and connected to Kratos' own, and leads Kratos to being able to reach across and finally shake Thor free of his reality, opening his eyes to the truth. Odin, on the other hand, is incredibly external. He is not connected to Kratos in any way other than the title of godhood they both share. He attempts to make personal plays to connect on Kratos' longing for family and peace, but it's all a lie. He doesn't really care. Odin is incredibly apathetic to everything and everyone in his life except for himself and the secrets to the universe that he craves so dearly. With villains on a personal level, you have a character who is very thematically close to the protagonist, and their connections further the development of one, if not both parties, towards the end. With the less intimate villains, you now have a character who may represent a theme or the ideas that the story is trying to represent more blatantly, but ultimately serves as an obstacle for the protagonist to move past, leaving the character arc to be dependent on the journey itself, rather than how it plays in regards to a foil. Now, for Gears of War characters, you really only need 2 aspects to make a decent, memorable impact on the series. A, to start with a kind of relatable and tragic loss that acts as the driving force of their story, the tragedy and grief that ties them to the greater universe, and B, to have a sense of identity and charisma that no other character has. For the Locust, this is twisted slightly. The identity factor is the same, but they're a villain, not a hero for us to latch onto. So instead of tragedy, their driving force is going to be a sense of presence, how threatening, skilled, or smart they may be. So we'll keep in mind both the identity factors that make each boss unique from the others, while keeping in mind how effective they are at being present and a threat in the story. And then to top it all off, we'll analyze how important they are to the story itself. If you could replace them with another character and nothing changes, then it's not really an important character to the story, which is a main complaint I have for a lot of the human characters in the series, like Ty, Jace, or the Carmines. If a villain is integral to the plot itself, they're an active part of the story, which makes for an even more memorable character, rather than a big baddie that's just here to be gunned down for the sake of the video game needing a thing to fight at the end. First and foremost is the General of the Locust Horde, the one who implemented and carried out the Emergence Day attacks. Raam, right hand of the Queen, a towering Theron who, for unknown reasons, literally grew to be twice the size of his cousins, taking the role of Uzil from his predecessor by force, impressing Myrrah enough as he shared her same scorched earth ideals for the surface and humanity above. The characterization of Raam is, well, non-existent. In the games, we only really see him snarl and stare at the heroes of Delta Squad. He is shown to be cunning right out, ambushing the landing zone and using the chaos of battle to sneak in and execute the COG leadership right out in the open, and in later appearances, like in Raam's Shadow, he mainly just follows along a short path while being talked up by Myrrah, but again, doesn't really do much but snarl. A lot of his presentation is physical rather than character or dialogue driven. Not that he'd have anything to say to the human characters, but outside of looking mean and stabbing the occasional gear, he's not really doing a whole lot. But the sheer size and imposing nature of Raam, along with how he leads strike teams from the front lines, will always make him feel more impressive than others of the Horde. Presence, sure, especially in the remade cutscenes of Ultimate Edition, Raam's redesigned and almost challenging stance, like he knows just how scared he makes those around him, are good standouts. Outside of the fact that he literally has 3 scenes in all of Gears of War 1, he does stand out quite a lot. Very basic in one way, but with the krill shield, serrated sword, and wielding a troika like a lancer really distinguishes him from the other Locust in the first game. Like a lot of the characters and plot points from Gears of War 1, Raam is super simple, but in that way, he kind of works. As I set up our requirements for a solid Gears of War villain, he kind of accomplishes both. He has a presence that feels unique. The weak point here is how useless he is to the story of Gears of War 1. He's a speed bump, a justification for a boss fight. Nothing about Raam's involvement really affects the plot in a way that couldn't be easily removed or replaced. Even the execution of Min, as the lore has expanded his role in E-Day and trying to target COG leadership explicitly, does make it feel like he should be around, but it's more a case of retrospective lore that justifies that first game, rather than him being important from the get-go. I mean, even Rod Ferguson said that Raam was one of the last things they added to that game, and his later characterization in the Rise of Raam comics is just not really helping. For most of the comic run, Raam simply laments about how they aren't doing enough and how he wants to desperately take the fight to the surface so that they aren't stuck to die underground fighting the Lambent. Why? Because the Locust must survive. He doesn't have any complex motivations or anything going on under the hood that doesn't just make him an extension of Myrrah. And in the comic, both Raam and Skorge talk like teenagers who just learned how to cuss, but that's a separate thing that just makes these ancient lizard people feel very non-mythical.
Swearing doesn't make you cool.
Now, I'm not saying any character in Gears needs layers of intrigue or super complex motivations. Most of the characters are one note, if they even have a motivation besides follow orders. But when you go to the length to give a character a whole comic run dedicated to their origins and come up on the Locust ladder of career opportunities, but fail to find any motivations besides the same general vibe we've been able to distill based on 2 scenes in 2006, you've seriously dropped the ball. Raam is an early 2000s action shooter final boss. Very flashy, somewhat memorable, but really lacking in the sense of having a character, as he's really only made of a singular motivation and a handful of generic bad guy traits. Does he work for Gears 1? Absolutely. Based on the rest of the first game's lack of or even poorly written story that was clearly rewritten multiple times, he's not that far off from the quality I would expect to find in that 2006 game. But does that make him a good villain? I'd say no. He's memorable, but sticking out is not all it takes to be a good villain. I mean, that one Savage Grenadier and Anvil Gate in Gears 3 is memorable too. Where our earlier example of Odin was apathetic but still had interactions with Kratos, Raam is totally detached from Delta, merely a big bad who's in the way of ending the game for good. The Great Cantus Priest, the personal bodyguard of the Queen and brutal leader who takes to piercing his own flesh and then practicing the torture and flaying of human captives in the Hollow, Ketor Skorge. Now, the second big bad in the Gears games is almost identical to Raam in presentation. Arrives during an ambush and kills or at least takes a character out of the story. They appear again in a short cutscene closer to the middle of the story so that we can see how they operate in regards to the greater horde, then a final and third scene where they battle with Marcus and Dom near the end before being killed and left to choke on their own blood, laying on their back. Except that Skorge doesn't even make it to the very end. He's killed a whole act earlier than the ending of the game, and well, he's much the same as Raam, not only in the lineage of both characters across the game's timeline, but also in theme and presence. Skorge is unique. He's tall and slender as compared to Raam's broad figure. He's fast rather than slow like most of the Locust. He is grand and seems to direct the Riftworm, making him somewhat important to the plot, at least more important to the plot than Raam was. He's striking and unique with long dreads, spiky kimono, and of course the dual-sided chainsaw staff, which is really perfect for Gears of War as a series. He stands out incredibly from the previous general, even if the same structure of the narrative is recycled for both Locusts so far. I mean, Raam was just a big Theron, literally.
Crazy bastard cut through a friggin' tank, though. He's gotta be a Locust big shot or something.
What, like Raam?
Maybe. But he made Raam look like a goddamn pushover.
And with his seeming control over the Riftworm, becomes immediately more impactful to the plot of the game. Now, we don't see much of this outside of one cutscene, and don't even see Skorge's perspective after the worm dies, which could go a long way in making him feel more fleshed out, but we just don't get that. I still think Skorge is not exactly a good villain. He's moving more along the lines of better when compared to Raam, in that I think it'd be harder to replace him in the script, but only so barely. For the most part, a lot of the same things I had to say about Raam still apply here. But going into Gears of War 3, we get our first properly invested villain. Queen of the Locust Horde, daughter of Sarah's most righteous species. Myrrah is certainly not a character that can be replaced in the series. As the matriarch of the Horde, she holds a very special purpose, as well as giving the Locust a kind of mysterious angle. From when she's introduced in Gears 2 as a mostly human queen, to all these lizard humanoids. In Gears of War 3, Myrrah ticks all the boxes of a strong interpersonal villain. While I think she mostly suffers as a lot of Gears characters do with a lack of dialogue and extended scenes, what we do get does fit firmly into the guidelines I'd set forth at the beginning. She's very present, riding atop the Tempest Beast, a war beetle that dominates the skyline whenever she's around. Her voice, loud and regal.
I will not let my people die! We have a right to live! A right to this world!
Booming and commanding. She speaks as if her words are true, not only that she believes in it, but that the universe would agree. Riding that line between a zealous servant of her own people and the furious queen all at the same time. Every scene that features her, she leads Marcus on, inviting us, the audience and Delta Squad, to ask more and more questions. Unfortunately, these are not all answered, but what we do get is always interesting to learn about.
Oh, what else don't we know?
You're a scientific man. Look at this later and try to understand what I wanted to do and what I had to do.
There are a lot of interesting questions that come up naturally between Myrrah and Marcus's banter and Adam Phoenix's later lamenting. But even though our cast asks these same questions, the script takes no time to breathe and let these ideas actually play out.
What the hell are you talking about?
It no longer matters.
Leading to a very flat sort of arc that's shrouded in mysteries which the plot refuses to answer. That's a general issue in all of Gears' writing, something the narrative leads have dubbed negative space writing, which I really find is a lazy excuse to just not include any amount of exposition whatsoever. A little bit of expansion that let us in on Myrrah and Adam's history, on her motives or backstory that made her and the Locust feel more nuanced. In just the last 30 minutes of Gears 3, the Locust are entirely reframed as a species that was set down the path of destruction from their forced creation, being told that Adam tried to save them but never could solve the lambency issue in time. There's a lot of interesting questions here that totally turns the idea of the Locust being unthinking, genocidal monsters on its head, but it comes up so late into the entire trilogy that it gets pushed past immediately, compounded by the total dismissal and lack of any introspection from any of Delta.
She knew your dad before E-Day? How? I mean, she looks human. Did she join the Locust Country Club for shits and giggles or something?
The bitch was just jerking his chain, man.
Like, there was this whole other story about Adam Phoenix and the Queen going on in the background that you learn about a whole half hour from the ending that feels really undercut from the rest of the story. If it were developed properly along the lines of a story like Halo 2, which gives us time with the Arbiter and the Covenant so that we can understand their dynamics going into the collapse of the Prophets, Myrrah could have been a fantastic character and villain, not just by Gears of War standards, but in all of gaming. But unfortunately, this reality where the Locust are properly fleshed out just doesn't exist, not even in the retrospective prequel stories that come after. And as such, Myrrah's potential suffers a lot. And by our metrics, Myrrah is going to be the best villain in Gears' story. She's cunning and threatening, still standing tall and affirmed of her own superiority even after her plot was foiled. She's present in the story itself, appearing multiple times, mostly just trying to stall Delta Squad, but it's more than Raam and Skorge got. And of course, she is irreplaceable in this story, where the previous generals can pretty much get replaced by any other faceless big bad from across Gears and serve the same purpose. Myrrah is definitely a unique standout who shows how effective the villains of the series can be. She's personally tied to the Phoenix family. Her human origins incite intrigue, and her zealous traits make her a kind of queen who cares for her people in an authentic way, building a lot of nuance into her story, and to me, makes the Locust a lot more sympathetic by the way her and Adam's dynamic reshapes the origins of the Locust and their war on the Lambent entirely. Queen Myrrah is a fantastic Gears of War villain and great for an action shooter, but falls just short of being known as one of gaming's greats. The Scourge of Groznia, the Destructor of Halvo Bay, General Karn, a deformed drone who rose to status and power by being cunning and brutal. While that title is awesome as hell, he falls right into the same category as Raam and Skorge. The characterization of Karn as an underdog who still made it is interesting, and his ties to Groznia and being a kind of boogeyman does make him very present in the story of Gears Judgment, as most of Judgment's campaign centers around trying to take him down explicitly rather than having him act as the obligatory bad guy alongside a different story. Karn's biggest issue is back to the tell, don't show style of storytelling that was present for the previous generals. We're told he's some crazy uber badass of the Locust that even a hardened soldier, a major of the UIR, Garen Paddock considers him to be a true threat, but we see him a total of 3 times, just like the other generals. He appears in the beginning where we see him leading a small army, not even really killing anyone of importance. Then we see him just walk off a nuclear bomb. Then he shows up at the very end out of nowhere before being gunned down. For a guy who was said to have brought down a whole country to its knees, especially the country that kept the Cog in a war for 79 years, him getting taken out in the first Cog city he arrived in a few weeks after E-Day feels very lame. Now, he's got presence. He's got an interesting background. Karn doesn't have much of a character, though. What's his motivation? What's he like? What does he hate about the Cog? Does he use overwhelming force or lead strike teams? At least with Raam and Skorge, we had a semblance of their tactics. Karn is just a character we're told is a big deal, then is absent for most of the game until he dies. And it's not even a case of we see how he's changed the Battle of the City. We see regular Locust, not the Wrath of Karn. We're reminded he's a big deal every time that Paddock volunteers to commit a war crime, but he just doesn't do anything, and the overall plot makes him feel incredibly weak. If anything, having Karn succeed in taking over Halvo would go a lot further to make the Locust feel like a threat so soon after E-Day and establishing a harrowing loss in the prequel. But instead, he's another speed bump that gets wiped out by a squad of soldiers who've been in uniform no more than a few weeks. What a scary villain he is.
What? I went from lieutenant to war criminal in less than a week.
Karn, a half-decent Gears villain, who I would say is on par with Skorge or Raam. At least he's actually important to the plot, but like with the rest of Judgment, his mere existence hurts his own credibility. Now, moving into the new age of Gears games, we have a villain that I don't need to introduce. Because there is nothing to introduce. The Speaker, a Locust who speaks. Yup, that's it. That's the villain of Gears 4. At least the closest we get to a villain. He shows up, steals Reyna, then shows up 6 hours later to say something cliche and die immediately after. Technically, the Speaker is almost identical in his purpose of the story as Raam was. He arrives to ambush the village and takes care of the leadership while taking them away. Then reappears hours later to be a tough fight, but is ultimately brushed off in the narrative. But considering he doesn't even get a name, hell, he doesn't even get a unique character model. The Buzzkill Scions and Horde are the same dude. I can barely call the Speaker a villain as much as you'd call the Mouth of Sauron a villain. But at least the Mouth was unique and interesting. In Gears 4, the Speaker is a lame narrative device that ultimately means nothing and doesn't even give us some half-interesting exposition. You don't even need to replace him if you just removed him entirely from the Act 4 fight in the dam. And I don't think anyone would blink twice. At the bare minimum, there's other characters on this list I could be disappointed in. The Speaker is just a big fat pile of nothing at all. The father and orchestrator of the Locust, Dr. Niles Samson, is our only properly human villain on the list, the scientist who led the New Hope Foundations, which tested on the children of miners afflicted with rust lung to develop the early forms of the Locust. Now, Niles is interesting as he's the only Locust apologist we see in the games. In some books there are references to characters, mostly unnamed stranded, who go mad and see the Locust as some sort of divine judgment, but Niles' motivation is more of the classic super soldier Albert Wesker kind. He sees the Locust as the evolution of humanity. As a character in the story, he's actually really integral. Whether I'm a fan of it or not, he is the creator and in some sense the inventor of the Locust Horde before seeing them move into and colonize the Hollows under Mount Kadar. His existence is incredibly tied to the history of the world, even if he's not really doing anything in the games. In Gears 2, he exists only as a glitching AI who is trying desperately to exposit and reveal lore, but Marcus and Dom can't be bothered to give a shit, and they only focus on trying to discover Locust tunnels.
Subjects.
don't know.
Niles could be removed entirely and replaced by a series of documents to read. While an important figure in the lore, he's not exactly contributing a lot to the story. In Gears 5, he's a lot more integral. We discover an even more advanced AI in a secret bunker, although Niles just continues to exposit while leading Kate to a device that can disconnect her from the Locust hive mind. Again, he isn't necessarily doing a lot, nor is he the antagonist of the story, more so a speed bump in the most literal fashion. Still a very simple premise. Mad scientist wants to make super soldiers. Literally nothing more than that. Unique for Gears, sure, but he's very cliched for the genre, and outside of being connected to the lore, there isn't a lot he's offering in either Gears 2 or 5. He's about as useful to the story as Nassar Embry. And if you don't know who that is, that's exactly my point. Now, the fact that this character exists is something that I truly despise. The creation of Queen Reyna is a baffling choice that makes it feel like the writer of Gears 5, Tom Bissell, who also wrote Gears 4, didn't read his own work. Right out the gate, Reyna, as a character, is a sin of writing. At the end of Gears of War 4, we find Reyna after her initial kidnapping from the Speaker. The Swarm are trying to force her to be a new queen because she carries Myrrah's bloodline. She's had her own flesh and soul welded onto the homunculus of the Swarm's hive, and Kate needs to cut her loose. In one sense killing her, but also freeing Reyna from this prison of her own blood. This is a cool and interesting premise, that the Locust need a kind of queen in order to be organized and develop into something greater. It also ties Kate's story into that of the bad guys, as she's the next heir in line, something that begins to be explored in Gears 5. But then she's able to just disconnect herself from this bloodline. Convenient. Then, after she does this, the Swarm somehow brings Reyna back to life and makes her into the queen anyways.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
I mean, what the fuck? What was the point of Gears 4's ending? What was the point of disconnecting Kate? You can't tell the audience, we need to do this so this other thing doesn't happen, and then just do it anyways. It's just about as lazy as the Resonator reveal in Gears 1 at the end of Act 3, but at least I can give them the excuse of the game coming out in 2006 under a different era and the lore of the universe wasn't super fleshed out at the time. By the time of Gears 5, the team at TC had been working on this reimagined sequel for at least 5 years at this point. On top of all of that, Queen Reyna is not a character at all, even less so than the generals who came before. She doesn't exist and then all of a sudden appears at the end of Gears 5 in a single scene, kills someone and then disappears. She doesn't have a motivation besides asking Kate to join them. She just wants to kill humanity again? We're back down to characters with one-dimensional motivations and stories. If that, she's nearly a half-dimensional character. I've had to improv BBEGs in D&D campaigns with more depth than Reyna. On top of her existence that makes no sense, Reyna is a boring, lazy, and actively antithetical villain to the story that Gears 4 and 5 were telling. She is not just a bad villain, but one whose existence is actively harmful to the game that introduces her. Now, Ukkon is getting us back into the theme of our Locust generals from earlier. Paired with the awkward, if not contradictory writing of the newer games, he is the chief chemist and geneticist of the Horde, developing great monsters like the Corpsers and Brumox, and experimenting with emulsion to make even stronger Locust soldiers. Now, first off, Locust come from emulsion exposure, so sure, it makes sense that he uses it to experiment. But we know by now that prolonged exposure turns Locust lambent. It's one of the reasons they attacked on Emergence Day, as their war with the Lambent was pushing them into a corner. So Ukkon, one of, if not the smartest of the Locust, using the very thing that threatens their society to juice up his own soldiers, feels kind of contradictory if nothing else. Myrrah directly declares the Lambent to be their mortal enemies, so by playing with Lambency we might expect Ukkon to be some kind of outcast from the Locust hierarchy. In fact, that'd make him very interesting, taking the mad scientist parallel with Niles to an extreme to give him some unique motivations, but this is just never developed. His motivation, like all Gears villains, is very narrow. He wants to make monsters and wage the Locust's war, following his orders, about as complex as the Locusts get. He's a solid connection to Sid's story, and the plot revolves around bringing him down, so at least Ukkon is a valid and important character to the plot, and he is a unique character in his presentation, the Lambent regeneration being an interesting aspect of his development that evokes the initial mythology of the Cantus from Gears 2. So, good Gears of War villain, plagued, as always, by strange, contradictory writing that could be solved by a solid chunk of exposition that simply does not exist. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There's other Locusts who appeared outside of the campaigns of the games, including Germad and Shrock, and it's possible we might get another tally to add when E-Day comes out, but it is a handy sampling of all the villains we've gotten so far. 5 that are just fine for an action shooter series, 2 that would honestly be better off not existing rather than even being ignored, and 1 properly filled in leader, aptly the Queen herself. Now, the point here wasn't just to go, oh, look how shitty the writing of Gears of War is. I do that enough anyways. And granted, for the time, comparing most games before The Last of Us kind of reframed how a lot of people looked at storytelling in video games, you're gonna get a lot of these same tropes, one-dimensional villains that are lacking in complex motivations. Now, it's also totally fine to have an antagonist with simple motivations who's not exactly sympathetic and feels almost cartoonishly evil. But it depends on the role of the antagonist in the story. A lot of the villains of Gears feel extra weak because they're somewhat flat, which would ordinarily mean the story has some time to focus on the relationships between the other characters and their own arcs. But we don't get that either. Gears' story rarely exists outside of the mission at hand. The plot is the only story, and everything else is an afterthought. That might sound confusing, but in short, it really means that nothing happens besides the mission. Everything else is tertiary. There's very few themes, subtext, or greater ideas to latch onto. None of these characters, besides Adam, Phoenix, and Dominic, get a solid character arc, where they change and evolve throughout the games and stories. JD starts to get one in Gears 5, but it's rushed and quickly undone. And with no story threads besides the main mission, which in itself can be very bland, the villains lacking any amount of character just makes them even flatter in execution. One of my greatest problems with Gears is that the games and universe have incredible concepts, really unique ideas, and are good at making characters that stand out, but never know how to dig deeper than a few inches. It's like making a realistic painting of a fruit bowl. On first glance, it might be amazing and look great from afar, maybe even tasty, but if you ever want to grab the apples on the canvas and take a satisfactory bite, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But that'll be it for today. As always, I want to give a giant thank you to all my members and patrons who you can join for just $1 a month to get your name up here on screen, or, like your least favorite white dad, get your name read aloud on the higher tiers. Get videos early and a few other behind the scenes extras all linked below. If you want even more, be sure to check on screen or check out the channel to find more Gears of War deep dives, some other fun gaming stuff, and even some nerdy crossover examinations like Warhammer 40k versus Helldivers, if that's more your speed. If you'd like a more broad breakdowns like this for other characters, let me know down below. As always, stay cool, have fun, and be awesome. Buster out.